All right, everybody, we are finally in episode number 7. This is, well, the last 2 episodes, this one, and the next solo episode is where we are going to be analyzing kind of like the meaty parts, the most difficult parts of, the exploration about desire and ethics that we have been doing for the last 7 episodes, basically, or 6 episodes. I know that you already know that we are going to tackle the problem with scientific objectivity. But let's recap so far, because I know that these are big ideas, okay? So last time we talked about how being a human being means being a moral agent. And that starts with how we evaluate our desires. And we look at Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor and his idea of a strong evaluation and weak evaluation, right? We said that a weak evaluation is when we compare desires based on what feels good or based on convenience, like preferring chocolate over vanilla ice cream, or maybe picking a mountain trip full of silence instead of going cycle in the city, just trying to see everything. So these are different. And what we were saying is that there's no moral weight to those choices. It's just about personal preference, even though it is a kind of evaluation. And that is the reason why Charles Taylor calls these type of evaluations weak evaluation, to refer to them as the non-moral evaluations that we carry out. But then there is what we call strong evaluation, where morality kicks in. It is when we don't just ask, what do I want? But instead, whether this desire is actually good, or maybe is it worth following this desire? And so we were giving many examples, right? Like how we experience this when we do something wrong, and after the fact you don't feel right. Oh, I should have done something different. So that is type of a moral reflection of what Charles Taylor calls a strong evaluation, right? And here's the key point. We do not invent these values, these things that we admire, that kind of like demand our respect and attention. We actually perceive them. Like the fact that we feel guilt, shame, or admiration shows that certain values like integrity or justice really have a hold on us. And also we realize that we are not just driven by our biological urges. We have more than biological desires. And this is what we call the meta-biological desires. These are desires that are shaped by a sense of the good. And whether we realize it or not, we are always acting with some kind of moral orientation, according to some moral law or some conception of the good, or in the language of Charles Taylor, some hyper good that we take to be true, even when we fall short of it. That is key, okay? So that was the point that I was trying to emphasize in the episode number 5. But in order to do justice to this topic, because it's quite complicated and it's basically the biggest, or one of the biggest philosophical preoccupations of my life, we need to address what we understand as objective and subjective, and how this is extremely connected to the tradition and the legacy of the scientific revolution in the 1600s and the standard of objectivity of the empirical sciences. So, oh man, it's gonna be awesome. I'm so excited. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Philosophy in Real Life podcast, where we strive to live meaningful lives by pursuing truth and unmasking the lies in our culture. I'm your host, Carlos Santos, a philosophy PhD from Spain. Welcome to Season 2, The Ethics of Desire. Okay, everybody, so today the big idea is the following. Truth is not always scientific. I repeat, truth is not always scientific. Much of what we typically call objectives comes from the way empirical science defines truth and knowledge. And that is why, if you pay attention to how people speak about this issue, that's why people often describe something as objective when it follows an impersonal standard, something that does not depend on anyone's opinion. For example, the law of gravity. The law of gravity holds true whether we like it or not. It doesn't depend on my mood or personal taste or what I want to do for holidays. On the other hand, when something is called subjective, it usually means that the criteria are personal. Maybe it is based on someone's individual perspective or feelings about something, right? In hard sciences like physics or chemistry, there are clear standards and methods that define what counts as true or objective knowledge. So scientific rationality demands that we meet certain criteria of proof and evidence before claiming something as objectively true. Now, this is generally speaking. We can identify at least two basic requirements that define objectivity in the empirical sciences. This will help us kind of like make it more specific, okay? So the first requirement is that we view reality from a disengaged perspective. So in other words, a disengaged view of reality. This means viewing reality from an impersonal, detached perspective, or what philosopher Thomas Nagel calls the view from nowhere. The view from nowhere. So in other words, describing reality as it truly is without the filter of human perception or experience. Now, other philosophers like Bernard Williams, for example, he refers to the very same idea as the absolute account of reality, which is basically explaining the world as if human existence did not factor into it, or explaining the world as if humans never existed, so to speak. Now, this is really important. So this is the first requirement, right? A disengaged view of reality. Key, super key. Now, the second requirement is that the objects of study have physical properties. I repeat, that the objects of study have physical properties. Now, in the empirical sciences, the objects of study are always physical things. These objects can be measured, they can be quantified, they can be described with mathematical precision or mathematical language in a lab or through an experiment. Now, by contrast, this is attention here because this is really, really important. By contrast, when we study morality, we are dealing with non-physical realities. When we study morality, we are dealing with non-physical realities, such as justice, dignity, or respect. Now, these can be quantified or captured in a formula, which is why moral knowledge does not fit the same model of objectivity as physics or chemistry. Now, the scientific, and this is key, the scientific approach relies on distrusting our human perception of reality. I will tell you what happened. There was a historical development, really, really important in the 1600s, okay? And in the 1600s, what happened was the scientific revolution, okay? And this was basically the beginning of the modern era. Scientists made an important distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. The primary quality of the objects were objective features of the world. Things like shape, size, motion, or number. For example, a ball is round and weighs a certain amount no matter who looks at it. So that will be primary qualities of the ball, basically, that we are analyzing or describing. And then you have secondary qualities. Now, the secondary qualities are the qualities that depend on the observer, on the person viewing the thing, like color, taste, or smell. So that same ball might look red to one person, but a colorblind person may see it differently. So it's a property of the human perception when we process reality. But here is the issue, and this is we need to understand this. If you finish this podcast and you understood this, oh man, I'll be so happy. The real problem with the scientific project was not the scientific method itself. I have no problems with science. The real problem with the scientific project was the attitude of the scientists. They began to treat this way of investigating reality as the only valid method to reach the truth. So anything that could not be described in scientific or mathematical language and that could not be verified by experiments was dismissed as subjective, just a matter of personal opinion. And this basically led to the idea that true or objective knowledge requires us to see reality from nowhere, basically stripping away our human perspective and relying only on what can be measured, calculated, and tested. And this mindset is called naturalism or scientism. And naturalism or scientism is the belief that only science can give us real knowledge of reality. Now, here is the irony. If you wanna, this is the big issue with scientism. It's a self-defeating philosophical attitude. Because you cannot prove that claim using the scientific method itself, because it's actually a philosophical statement about the limits of knowledge, not a scientific finding. The scientific method feels so reliable because it is true. It gives us a sense of certainty, especially when we are studying or dealing with physical objects or the physical world. You can run an experiment, and if done properly, you'll get the same result every time. Fair enough, that is powerful. And this is why science has been so successful in fields like physics, chemistry, or biology. But this is the issue. Just because this method works for understanding natural reality best does not mean that it is the only or the right method to study morality or human behavior or society. And to emphasize the point that I made before, saying that the scientific method is the only valid way to know things is not itself a scientific claim. It is actually a philosophical or metaphysical belief, a statement about how knowledge works, not a conclusion of science itself. So ironically, the belief that only science can lead to real knowledge isn't something that science can prove. It's an assumption about reality, not a scientific fact. And that is the big problem with naturalism or scientism as a whole. Now I would like to focus on what is the big issue with scientism or naturalism when it comes to the study of moral knowledge or human behavior. Okay, so I want to even make it more specific for us to understand the ramifications of adopting as a view of reality the naturalist attitude. Now, number one, the big problem with this is that it requires to ignore the very thing we need to study, which is the way we perceive the good in our human experience. And as we discussed before, we cannot escape our moral orientation. It's built into being a human being. In order for us to act in the world, we need to be guided by an aim, by something, by a higher good, by something that we deem important, of some value. And that's what makes us act in the world, okay? If we feel thirsty, then we seek water. Or if we want racial justice, or if we want a fulfilling life, then we do X, Y, and Z. So it is built into us, in our action, in the way we perceive reality as a place of value. And the problem with this requirement is that we need to neglect it. We need to already, right out of the gate, call these values something subjective, that they are the source of error, because these are secondary qualities of the world. We are just projecting values or qualitative judgments about reality when this is not objective according to the scientific model. And that is true. It's not objective according to the scientific rationality. But what I'm refuting here is this assumption that the scientific method is the right method to study moral knowledge or to study human behavior. That is what I'm questioning, because it neglects the very thing that we need to study, which is how we as humans perceive reality and how we as human beings perceive values and the good. So how are you going to ask me right out of the gate to ignore the very thing that I need to understand? I don't know if that makes sense. Now, the second issue with scientism or naturalism is that it denies the epistemological utility of other methods of inquiry. What do I mean by that? For example, in a courtroom, a judge determines guilt based on evidence and reasoning. So it is not 100% certain, like physics. It is, but just because it's not meeting the requirements of the scientific method, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's not rational and objective, for example, because there is reasoning implied. It's not just, oh, whatever, you are guilty and you are not, just because, I don't know, I didn't wake up with the best mood today. No, there is still a process, an objective process that we use to arrive at the truth of who is the guilty person, right? Similarly, you can think of the historical methods. For example, historical methods help us understand the past with a reasonable degree of objectivity, although not with absolute certainty. Okay, so we in philosophical language, we should distinguish between certainty and plausibility, plausibility, right? Something is more plausible, maybe it's more likely that something has happened in reality if you compare it to other possible answers to a phenomenon or to an issue or to a crime, for example, all right? But just because we are not 100% certain, that doesn't necessarily mean that method of inquiry or that method to arrive at that conclusion, such as the historical method, is of no value. No. I mean, different domains of reality require different methods, and rejecting them just because they are not scientific is actually narrow and unjustified. It's not justified. It is falling into the assumption, again, that science itself can prove, by the way, that all methods, only the scientific method can give you true knowledge of reality. Well, not really. Physical reality, yeah, but not about moral knowledge or historical knowledge or, relationship knowledge, type of like things that you discover in your lived experience as a moral agent. In short, scientism reduces all knowledge to one method. That's basically the issue. And it requires us to neglect the very thing that we need to study, which is how us as human beings experience reality, meaning, values. Now, to be fair, when it comes to morality, the naturalist's biggest objection is this. A naturalist will say, hold on, Carlos, wait a second. These objects you are talking about are not physical objects. They're just value claims, opinions about how people live, parent, govern, love. How can that even be objective? And I understand that is a fair question, and it is a tough question. It took me a long time to even come up with a good answer to this. And it's not even my answer. It was through a study and trying to compare different schools of thoughts in ethics and history of ethics and things like that. That is a good question, right? How can these objects be objective if these are non-physical objects, right? Values are not there where you can study the weight of it or the roundness or things like that. No. Fair enough. We can make matters worse for us. If we cannot even agree on what's just or unjust or good or bad, how can we possibly claim that moral objectivity is real? And that is exactly the challenge that we will tackle in episode 9. And I will argue that what we need isn't to reject objectivity, but to expand what we mean by it. To include, so to speak, a richer, deeper form of moral objectivity. The big question is, how do we get there? How do we get there? Well, that's the focus of the final episode of the first part of the Ethics of Desire. And don't forget to watch episode number 8, where Tristan and Santi and I will discuss this difficult idea about the problem with scientific objectivity. But anyways, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.